So, a good way to start off this first episode is probably for me to just clarify as deeply and simply as I can the intention for this podcast. Like, what's the feeling behind it? What's the motivation behind it? Why do I feel called to not just offer my teachings, but offer it in this particular format of the podcast, of the dialogues, of addressing sort of people's particular questions and themes and struggles and their worldly types of issues and movements that we're seeing happening in the world and stuff. And basically, I cannot introduce this intention without making some sort of a claim that kind of comes off as a bit arrogant. But it's the truth from which I operate, and it's the truth from which these podcasts are hosted. And so without that foundation, I mean, I can beat around the bush, but I have a message. I have a reason for sharing that message. And I think the only way to address that is to make the claim that where I come from is different than where most people come from. So let me kind of start with that. First of all, the title, Mirror Talks. I consider myself a being who is, for the most part, rooted in what I, in my teachings, call mirror consciousness. This is a state of consciousness that is not just a human personality anymore. It's not just a human state of consciousness. It's not what most people know. It goes far beyond the extent of what most people have access to on their day-to-day living experience. Unless perhaps, they experiment with psychedelics or stuff like that, which I don't promote, by the way. But just as an example, that the state of consciousness that I have access to, although it is accessible and it is innate to everyone, and therefore it's not special in me, it is rare that someone accesses it to the extent that I and some others do, because it requires practice, it requires devotion, it requires deep understanding, it requires a gutting out, like an emptying out of the ego construct, a relentless self-investigative process, a relentless self-deconstruction process. That, to the degree that I've done that, is simply not going to be everyone's cup of tea. But the results of doing that, the results of such a process, the results of such relentless inner work, is now what is available through me and to me. And so from that state of consciousness, for lack of a better word, which I call the mirror state or the mirror being, everything else is different. Everything else is seen from a different light. Everything else is approached from a completely different motivation and state of consciousness than is common to this world. And if a person dissolves its personal layers, its personal biases, its personal preferences, its personal thoughts, if it investigates all that, if it, in the proper way, deconstructs the material of the personality construct, all the filters, all the assumptions, all the beliefs that we've gathered around our consciousness, and that has turned us into this self-identified little human being, with all the limitations and all the suffering and all the confusion and all the ignorance and all the doubts and all the insecurity and all the paradoxes and all the polarities and all the war and all the conflict that generates. Basically, what's responsible for the state of the world as we see it today is a lack of mirror consciousness. Or you could say it's the addition onto the natural state of all beings, which is that mirror consciousness, which is that pure, undefined, undifferentiated unity consciousness. And onto that, we have added tons and tons of filters of assumptions and social conditioning and personal conditioning and mental emotional conditioning and desire for safety and security, because we've identified with the physical body and we've identified with the personal mind inside the physical body, and so on and so forth. So there's a ton of layers that typically generates what I call person consciousness. In my teachings, I describe person consciousness. Then beyond that is shepherding consciousness. Beyond that is mirroring consciousness. And then beyond that is a gateway consciousness, or the gateway. I won't get into that right now, but just for the overview. So most people are in a state of perpetual person consciousness, personhood. They are in a state of consciousness which is completely inundated with and encapsulated by a string of near endless layers of thought and assumption and belief and conditioning and fears and pain and emotion, to the degree where the world that they think they're perceiving is nothing but the projection of their own imagination, their own distorted imagination. It's a projection of their beliefs. It's a projection of their thoughts. We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are, right? Kind of a famous statement. I very much agree with that statement. And that is the result of a lack of purity with which we investigate ourselves. Typically, people's quest for self-inquiry, for self-realization, for self-discovery doesn't go beyond the conceptual realm. From time to time, we ask ourselves, who are we? Why are we here? We kind of wonder, we ponder. We may have sort of an intuitive download or two. We may experiment with meditation a little bit, but we never really get, for the most part, people never really get to a profound identity state change that is possible, which is what I'm claiming I have or am. And so from that state, I can say that I see the world very differently than I used to. I interact with the world in a very different way than I used to. I interact with people in a very different way than I used to. I interact with whatever you could call myself, like my own body and my own mind, in a very different way than I used to and than most people do. Now, from this state of oneness consciousness, unity consciousness, from the mirror state, there is an inescapable, inevitable, natural compassion that's just intrinsic to that. And it's not that illogical if you understand that it is a state of oneness consciousness, an understanding of the unity of all things. So if I am truly experientially recognizing the unity of all things from a clear state of consciousness, so that intrinsic compassion or love is not so illogical if you can kind of imagine this mirror state consciousness as truly being a state of mind. And it's not a state of mind, but a state of consciousness, a state of being, wherein the entity that is in that state of consciousness, or that is that state of consciousness, recognizes the oneness, the inseparability of all things. So if you imagine deeply feeling and recognizing that everything that you experience is part of your own body, almost. It's part of your own expression. It's part of your own self. It is your own self appearing. It's your own self that is, you could call it manifest, but in the later stages of this deconstruction work, you realize that manifestation is an illusion. I think a good place to start is just to ask yourself how open you are to a different view, knowing that it's not about jumping from one view to another view, because that's what we've been doing for millennia, and it hasn't been the solution to human suffering. But rather, if you're open to another view, then you can listen to a mirror consciousness type of dialogue or reflection, and you can get an intuitive access to the skillfulness that I'm trying to promote here, that I'm trying to encourage. So just for this week until the next episode, ask yourself every day in sort of a meditated, relaxed state of mind, how willing am I to look at my own beliefs, at my own conditioning, and become, as Kelly said beautifully, to unbecome those things in order to reveal to myself, to discover experientially deep within my own consciousness, my own potential, what is possible, and am I open to that possibility? Am I desirous of that possibility?